Andrea, who is been also working on community energy. I think is a bit similar like what we heard from Patrick. You are a researcher, but you're also practically involved in community energy, and you're going to speak about the situation in Canada. And just confirm to me that you would also say a few words about the situation in the US in case that John has problems to join us here today.
Yes, thank you.
Andrea,
thank you.
Great pleasure to have you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is it clear? Okay,
Yes.
Wonderful. So good morning, everyone. It is early morning here, and I'm sure it's already late evening where you may be. So I'm happy to be here to give you a Canadian report on what's happening. I wear two hats. I am also an academic at the University of Saskatchewan in the School of Environment and Sustainability. And we have some exciting things happening with community power in a new program that I'll speak to shortly, as well as I'm a developer, an energy developer with a company solely focused in community renewable energy power. And I've been doing that for over, it feels like over 15 years now. So let me take you on a little ride through Canada. So in Canada, we're quite diverse, many different colors. We're a very large country, a lot of very different resources depending where you are, and a lot of different political structures and legislation. So in Canada, energy is legislated at the provincial level. So every province has its own way of doing things. We don't really have a national regulation, although we have lines that cross the country. So I like to say together we create. That's really our solution. We need to come together in community and find optimal solutions for our power needs. And we've discussed a little bit about what community means, but we see a lot of things around the world, different community power projects. But in Canada, we don't actually have too many historical type of community-led developments. There was a feed-in tariff in Ontario that really was the leading way in North America back in 2009. And Nova Scotia on the eastern side of Canada followed with a community feed-in tariff specifically for communities. Types of communities were like universities, cooperatives, community centers, and First Nations Aboriginal projects. But all of that has since changed. Most of the motivation behind these power projects from communities are for local economic development. But we do have four things that I point out that sort of are issues around that we need to have an engaging community-based projects to maximize local benefits. We need to have a competitive energy industry that values, like we don't need it, but we need a competitive energy industry that values both large power for the scale of what we need to do in Canada, but also community-based projects. And right now it tends to be on the side of the large scale as opposed to the community. But we also need to have clear and stable policies and legislation to support these type of projects. And we do need to also have renewable energy considered more mainstream. It's still on the side of, well, it's still new in some places where we know it's in other jurisdictions, it's not. So this was a chart that came out of my own research that I've put together, and it really comes back to everything that we're talking about, that we need community ownership, community development, and capacity building around energy and generation and sustainability. And this is because we find in not only in the research, but what we see in action is that communities benefit from renewable energy generation because of the diversity in the supply that it provides, making it more secure. It provides a sufficient supply and independence that communities strive for. The ownership of these projects creates long-term interest and local support and does return money to the community. And I'll show you some economic numbers later. And also the local job creation that stimulates the economy. And I happen to have this slide in here, and we just heard from Patrick, who actually made this slide. So well, not slide, but the chart on this slide. So I thought that was kind of great that he spoke just before me, and it just emphasizes his work as well in what I do, in that what does community power look like, and that we do find that we're playing in that top quadrant where A, B, and C are located But what we are starting to see is large-scale power projects, and some of my own work with my own professional community work through my company, we were developing large-scale community power projects to the scale of 300 megawatts. Now, this sounds incredibly large, and it was incredibly controversial because at that time, this is 10 years ago when we started, it was unseen and unheard of. It set a precedent in Canada for developing community-owned power projects at the utility scale. And what we found along the way there was, yes, just like Patrick mentioned, there are struggles with communities having the skill sets of technical skills and legal and financial, but that's because they're not the farmers usually in Canada who have these large pieces of land that can do large wind projects. But what they didn't have, they just hired for. And if you find partners that you can hire that come from a community mindset, that helps to enable community power projects. And that's why we were able to get it so far to negotiating a PPA and finding partners and investors in these projects. With that being said, the community still did struggle to get that PPA, but that had more to do with policies and issues within the Canadian energy sector, specifically to the province of Manitoba. So that's a whole other discussion, but we do see communities now getting into the megawatt scale of projects, and I will talk a little bit about that shortly. So there are modern community challenges, obviously local development that requires support mechanisms, which we discussed. And previously in the early days of wind, you would normally see smaller scale projects that local communities and groups could come together and fund. But now we're seeing these large scale projects that require millions of dollars of investment. And that's where the challenge really hits home for these communities, is that they need to find the right partners. And I can tell you from my own experience, on the business side, we were approached by many people who wanted to partner with us, but didn't necessarily have the community mindset. So we were very intentional about finding the right partner who would also develop the project from a community mindset, who was willing to partner with us with maintaining, allowing the community to maintain their community ownership. And then, of course, bringing the money, bringing the technical parts to it, and finding the innovative business structure so that the community could retain ownership. Even if it took a long time to pay it off, they would still have ownership in the meantime. So there's some innovative things you can do around that. So some of the challenges that community power does face, and I've put this into a graph so that you can see it here, is that there is a lack of public knowledge around technology and state-of-the-art practices. So that's one of the things we need to help with the information coming out. There's a lack of legislation in a lot of jurisdictions, and just a general lack of community power. It does take a lot of effort and a lot of volunteering, and sometimes that becomes a full-time job for some community members. So there's things to be thought around how to make those things work better when you're doing a community project. And also local support mechanisms and a lack of autonomy does happen sometimes in the selection process of renewable energy projects. They're quite complex. You do need to have a renewable energy power purchase plan and other things that normal utilities are very comfortable with. So it's this knowledge transfer that has to happen at this scale. And there's always a disproportionate amount of authority when you're coming up against utility projects in the power generation industry. But with all that being said, we've hit a beautiful confrontation point, which is really what I like to say is the catalyst of a revolution. And Robert Poole is a foundational father of design engineering, and I myself as an engineer always look to that. And one of the things of wisdom he has said is that a revolution succeeds when the community accepts the innovation as worthy of development. And that is really key to remember, because if there's no will, there won't be a way. And that's why a lot of community projects drop off, because the challenge is overwhelming. So you need to find the right partners from the get-go to establish the business structure of the project, and then to do all of the other work that it will encompass. And we are at this confrontation point that I just spoke about, because energy security is the biggest threat to humanity. We were all facing high costs of electricity, unreliable systems, and threatened quality of life. Populations become vulnerable, and it remains under the control of foreign interests. And right now in Canada, under the COVID crisis, obviously, a lot of our First Nations are very remote. They are, some of them, only accessible by fly-in community. The ice roads are at a point of melting, so there is you know, in winter, some communities have ice roads that have access to them. Now we're sort of at this thaw point where they may be, depending because they're further up north, they may still be okay, but they're starting to thaw out. So these communities are really, really remote in our own country, and they often face similar crises that we see in developing countries. And that's one of the reasons of my passion in my work, is what I brought back from my work overseas, is bringing this back into my own backyard, because we have these crises in Canada as well. So with that being said, there is hope, and that is in finding energy sovereignty, and that requires the use of Indigenous natural resources that are local to that population. So looking at the topography, looking at the resources, and really defining what is that right mix of energy in that region for that community, because that will obviously enable what is the best recipe. And so we have this shifting energy paradigm right now, and the way that we inhabit the communities of tomorrow cannot be by the ways of today. And this is just an example. If you see a community, this is up in one of our First Nations, a lot of these power lines with all these little homes right beside each other. And, you know, you think just how does it look? How is it, are there other ways this can be done? So this is a really old paradigm, and we're hoping to shift to new ones. And so just to give you a sense of a Canadian perspective, clean tech is Canada's fastest growing industry, and it's supposed to be a $50 billion industry and employ over 100,000 Canadians by 2022. Obviously, this was pre-COVID. Right now, we have an emergency. But with that being said, we have a lot of natural resources and a lot of potential to use these natural resources. And this graph just shows you a little bit of that mix of what is actually the spread in Canada. And this is obviously changing all the time. But power generation is about 15%, and the smart grids at about 7%, and green buildings 15%, and so on and so forth. So types of energy, well, we're seeing, you know, the conventional system which has always been generation, transmission, distribution, purchasing, service, consumer, is obviously being disrupted by the rise of the prosumer, and we're going straight to the service, from service to consumer, just by implementing storage. So with that, we are seeing a huge disruption, but that means that communities can use any type of resources that are right for them. So there's many types of renewable resources and many types of storage mechanisms, and what's ideal is finding the right mix. And so when we look at distributed generation, which is some part of my research, it's not just about putting things here and there, it's about how they connect and how we build smart microgrids. And these microgrids, they need to be intelligent so that they can optimize the best solution for these communities and these remote communities, because they are most susceptible to the impact of climate change and obviously pandemics and other crises that we feel around the world. They will be the first and the most vulnerable in these circumstances to be impacted, especially islands, and also locations that are geographically, you know, and electrically islanded. So up in Northern Canada, for example. And so when we look to building these systems, we really need to make them intelligent so that they can make the most of these benefits. So there are some opportunities, barriers, and mitigation that I want to talk to you about and tell you what's happening in Canada. We have a renaissance happening for First Nations, and they're coming, there's so much happening with First Nations in our remote communities right now. It's a really exciting time. It's a new way for them to connect to the land and build autonomy and build resiliency, which is really key when we're talking about microgrids. But there's a warning here that we can't just simply go in and implant technology on reserves. It's not like that. And regardless if it's a reserve or if it's non-reserve community, if it's just a rural community, you can never do that. You need community buy-in. And this is also just from my own experience working in the field. Otherwise, renewables won't work. I want to show you some of the prices of what our First Nations and Northern communities are facing. In my urban baseline where I am, compared to my neighbors up in Northern Canada, they pay 37 times more expensive electricity than what I pay in my city where I am. And I'm currently in Winnipeg. Just to give you a sense of what that looks like, in the red circle here, there are 4 diesel communities. They are still impacted. They're disconnected from the grid, and they are diesel powered. Their price for electricity their base price is 63 cents per kilowatt hour Canadian, and their price could go up to $2.36. I know since I've published this data, that price has increased. So they're even higher now. And so any institution that is a federal government, a First Nations education, or provincial government is looking at paying that $2.36 per kilowatt hour. And this is astonishing because not a lot of people recognize that it is so expensive in our remote and northern communities, especially those that import diesel for their power. It's, if not more, it is more than in some of the Caribbean islands that I've worked with. So keeping that in mind, we do at the University of Saskatchewan, where I am an assistant professor at the School of Environment and Sustainability, we are just going to be launching a new Masters of Sustainability and Energy Security. This is a really, really exciting program because it is focusing on community energy development. And so we are teaching the principles of how do you build community energy projects, specifically for remote locations, specifically northern Indigenous communities. And this is a flagship program that has already been funded, and it has a 7-year window that we're working on. And the Master in Sustainability is a brand new program, and it's going to be launching in fall of 2020 for admissions that you can start the program remotely. We also have certificates that are going to be available in case you don't want to do the whole master's program. There are certificates that you can learn certain things about how do you launch a community energy program. So it's really interesting. First of its kind program in Canada in any university. So it's a really exciting time. And if you'd like more information about that, feel free to reach out to me after. This is a snapshot of Indigenous community power projects across Canada. If you haven't seen, we have a lot of renewable energy power projects happening across Canada. And I'm going to show you some examples of those projects right now, just to give you a sense of what that landscape looks like across Canada. You can see here on this graph, we have different types. We have feasibility studies, energy plans, and then we have actual projects: solar, hydro, geothermal, wind, bioenergy, efficiency, etc. And there's differences across all the provinces and territories in Canada. In terms of total projects in Canada, we're seeing, and this is kind of rough because this is just Indigenous community energy projects, and there are definitely more that have not been mapped yet, and there's definitely rural community projects happening as well that are renewable energy focused. So we have over 300 projects, and this is sort of a spectrum across Canada, what that looks like. Here are some examples of projects. Up in the Yukon, we have a project called Old Crow, and it's about a 1 megawatt solar array. And this was a First Nation owned project and operated, and it's going to be a 25-year period. So I have some statistics on these, so you can look at these slides later, but I'm just going to keep going through them so you can quickly see all the interesting things happening in Canada. I'm not going to do all of them, just highlighting a few. In Northwest Territories, in the Yellowknife, in Northwest Territories in Let's Selkie First Nation, we have a 35 kilowatt solar power array that's gone out. So a smaller project, but still quite big up in a northern community. In Green Lake, Saskatchewan, this is a 96 solar panel project, and it's a 31 kilowatt system. It powers 90% of both the community hall and the neighboring rink, and it's 100% community owned. It was funded by a federal government, Canada's 150 program, that provided about $60,000. And then there was other funding that the community received. Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan has an interesting biomass project that they are putting in their bioenergy center. It's going to be 6.6 megawatts, which is a really large project actually, and it has received money from the Canadian government at almost nearly $53 million, which is quite significant. In Cowessess First Nation, Saskatchewan, they've done a 10 megawatt solar array, but this is also in complement to some of the other things that they have happening north of their site. They also have an Enercon E53 800 kilowatt wind turbine. They have a 500 kilowatt solar array, and they have a battery storage system as well. And so they've received some funding. This new project is just being built. We have also situations where we have joint projects like sister projects, I guess that's how we call them. And this one is two communities that have come together, and the project showcases Indigenous equity ownership. It's 51% owned by the First Nations. It's 25.5% from one nation and another 25.5% from another nation. So we have projects in BC. This one's 100% owned by a First Nation. And another one, this is a large one that would power 5,000 homes. It's the largest solar farm on banned land in BC. And this is another one just on Vancouver Island, which was a really nice microgrid that they put together, 6 kilowatt PV, 7 kilowatts on the hall. And they as well received funding from the government. And I believe they have a battery backup system as well. So just to highlight what's happening in Toronto, Toronto Renewable Energy Cooperative is well known for the wind turbine that sits in Toronto. If you've ever flown into Toronto there, they have a couple things that are interesting happening out of there. And one of those things is the solar share. And I want to speak to that a little bit because they use this thing called solar bonds. And it's really interesting. They just in themselves, the solar share program had was awarded a feed-in tariff contract. And this feed-in tariff program in Ontario has been going since 2009, and there's been 7 rounds of it. So this is still, they have data up until I think it was 2016 showing that they were still getting funds through their feed-in tariff. There's a percentage of generation capacity set aside for Aboriginal community and municipal and public sector entities. Now, Solar Share is a cooperative, and they've developed 17 rooftop PV projects ranging from 100 to 500 kilowatts. And there are some more, I would suggest go check out what solar bonds are if you're interested. There's a lot of information about it there and how that works. Some direct economic impacts that I just wanted to highlight here for a moment is that...
Yeah, if you could
wrap it? Okay, I'll just... Okay, so what I will do then is I'll show you the screen, and then I would just suggest to go and take your time after when you can to look at this, but there are some results that show the differences if you have 0 domestic or 0 renewable energy as in project A, 0 community versus complete community, project C, and B is halfway in between. Just some of the economic benefits that sprinkle back down into the community. So you can look at this, and it does reference through TREC Online. That's the Toronto Renewable Energy Cooperative, published that. And there's a green standard for green building in Toronto. And I guess I'm probably just going to leave it there because I do have some other things I can share with you, but it comes down to innovative business structures to mitigate this, policy as well, and having to take down these, just having mechanisms in place in policy and legislation to support renewable energy. I'm going to skip through there. There's so many things happening in Canada, but at the end of the day, that is, a longer discussion. So thank you, Stefan.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And I think you touched very important points here. And in particular, I think it's very good that you focus so much on the indigenous communities, which I think is a topic that actually would require its own webinar to talk about that. And yeah, it's great to see the diversity of community-based projects that we have in Canada. And I'm assuming you agree we can make your presentation, not only the recording of this, but also the presentation available on the website so that everybody who has interest in learning more about these projects can have a look.
Absolutely. And just reach out to me at my university address, a.kraj@usask.ca, if you're interested in any follow-up.
Very good. And then I see one question here, if you can read it as well, from Dirk. He asks whether you know the US organization NRECA International Co-op.
No, I'm not familiar with that. I'd probably have to look it up, but there is, if John Farrell was supposed to speak, I'm not sure if he's here, but he was supposed to talk more about what's happening in the US, and he works with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, I believe that's what it is.
Yeah.
And yeah, I didn't get a chance to talk about that, but definitely look at them. And in the US, they have some interesting models. And one of the, just to speak a little bit about the business cases, we use a multi-stakeholder cooperative in Canada and Manitoba to help with how you can have multi-stakeholders investing in these community projects. So that would also probably be a bigger discussion.
Very good. Well, it seems that John is not with us. John, I really have no idea. We were in touch the last couple of days, and he registered, confirmed his presentation. So that is a bit unfortunate. But then, Andrea, then with this, you've been the last speaker of our webinar now. We can still see whether we have any questions coming from our the audience that is still here.
I was just going to highlight, I don't know if you can hear me, but in terms of the US, I can, where did I have their slide? There was a system that they use, here it is. It's called Community Choice Aggregation. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it's quite popular in the US, where there are 8 states in the US that have enacted a CCA. It's an enabling law, and they're Massachusetts, Ohio, California, Illinois, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, and Virginia. And they serve about 5% of Americans in 1,300 municipalities. And this allows, the main goals of it are to either lower the costs of consumers or allow consumers greater control of their energy mix. So it aggregates purchasing power in groups so that they can create large contracts with generators. And that's just comparing that to what we do in Canada, or at least in Manitoba, with a multi-stakeholder cooperative model. So you're able to invest, bring other people into the pool of the investment. So.
Very interesting indeed. Very good. Well, I think we've got today really very interesting feedback from different parts of the world. Now, this is just the industrialist world. We people here, the speakers, I know that some of the people in the audience are from the so-called developing world, but we are from those countries where there is usually enough money available to make the investment. Let me mention again that we will have another webinar on the 24th of June, where we will invite people from the developing world to speak about the situation in the developing countries. But it was, I think it's been very interesting today, and just meeting here together, just the different, actually, it's coming closer to each other, how we understand what community power is. That I think has been worthwhile to exchange. And I think what I also hear from the speakers here is that most of us, we do expect a kind of decentralization process as in response to the current corona crisis, which then will lead to a more important role for community energy. I think this is enough inspiration for me to suggest that we should certainly put that somehow together in a short paper, in a statement that maybe can be supported by some of the organizations that are here present as well. Certainly something that we'll be working on, but I think it would be a good time to do that after the session with the developing countries as well, because it should be clear that we want to see community energy not exclusively as something for wealthy people or people who have money, but for everyone around the world. Yeah, I see that there is some agreement on that. So with that, unless anyone would like to make any other statement now, I would say thank you very much to all of you, in particular to the speakers. Some of you getting up early, some of you staying awake quite late night. Again, let me mention 24th of June will be the next webinar on community energy. We will do the next webinar in 2 weeks from now, which will be about renewable energy policies. And one of the partners we will have there is the Energy Watch Group.